This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On February the 9th, our Third Afghanistan Luncheon took place, commemorating all those who served in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2014. Our guest of honor this year, as in past years, is Major General Dennis Thompson. This year he is joined by a panel of Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Taylor and Regimental Sergeant Major Anthony Jones, with moderator Major Austin Douglas.
Down. It's a bit of a flat. If you want to stand up while you're talking or remain seated, up to you and how you sort of want to stretch out that, stress that out. I'll jump in. Do we have a chance to chat? And I think we have about 50 minutes for today. The goal is hopefully about 30 minutes of us talking and then throw it open to questions that you'll have for them. And if there's none, I got a lot of questions to begin. So I think we'll start at the top a little bit. I think, when you think of Afghanistan, it's definitely a soldier's fight at the section commander level, for sure. The combat team commander has an opportunity to get out there and do operations. And the battle group and that ecosystem of how we see Afghanistan is as a company fight. And I think sometimes you don't necessarily pay attention to or understand what is happening at the formation level, and being a formation commander and understanding the risks that need to be taken and whether it leads to success or failure. So maybe at a high level, to get this conversation started, then, what are some of the things that maybe we don't pay attention to, don't understand, don't see that is taking place at your level while you're there?
The first thing is you don't take your cue from a subordinate, number one. Number two, listen, I got cue cards here. Why? Because if you read the news this morning, you would have heard about this gentleman named Biden who, quote, is an elderly man with a poor memory. That applies to myself because I suffer from a disease called AHS, or Acquired Helplessness Syndrome. Since I retired, having, as Todd knows only too well right now, he's looked after. He doesn't have to worry about too much. He gets his tickets punched literally for him, and he makes his way around the city with no fuss or no muss. I actually had to book my ticket this morning and navigate from the airport to here. And as you know, I'm also the colonel of the regiment. I just want to reassure people that today's soldiers are no different than the soldiers that we all served with in Afghanistan, and they are, quote, tactfully candid. So they're not subservient, don't get me wrong, and they'll definitely tell you if you're stepping in the poo. But they're certainly all about the mission and very keen on the mission. And so I'll start my comments first by a confession. Unlike the people you're going to hear from here shortly, I've never stuck my hands in the goo. I've been on several missions, but when you're a commander, you're that tactical bound behind. Even if you're in the field while you might arrive on the scene, you're not the person applying the tourniquet. You're not the person that's applying the dressing, and so you're already one step removed from the physical trauma that other people feel. And while you might get shot at and be nervous at certain moments, you're not the one that's at risk the same way as your soldiers are. Nevertheless, in Afghanistan, I managed to pile on 16,500 kilometers in my LAV in 9 months. Why? Because we didn't have any helicopters. And that takes us back to the Manley Report. And so I just thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about what the government of Canada wanted the formation commander to do on the ground. We had 6 priorities. Number 1, build the ANSF, or the Afghan National Security Force. Number 2, support jobs and education in Kandahar City. Number 3, provide humanitarian assistance. Number 4, border security. Number 5, develop the federal government in Kabul. And number 6, help out with reconciliation. And we were assigned 3 signature projects. The Dam, as we like to call it, or the Dalla Dam. The polio vaccination in 50 schools. Go down that list, and only the first one applies to the military, even though we were the lion's share of the people on the ground, and only half of the first one applies to the military because we didn't really develop the police. That was the RCMP's job. So if you get sent overseas and you don't have a complete set of orders, you got to make the stuff up as you go along. And that's where counterinsurgency enters. And our biggest challenge, I would say, from a commander's perspective, pardon me, is that we all know the doctrine, clear, hold, build, which I did with this gentleman here. Because General Habibi and I, we walked around on several occasions with his soldiers and with my soldiers. If you can clear an area of the ground, but you can't hold it, then you're just going to have to come back later and do it again. In other words, you're mowing the grass and doing a whole series of disruption opportunities. So while it's not maybe as interesting as some of the other stories you're going to hear, I'm going to tell you that a commander's responsibility, as well as down and in, with his partners, etc., and with the forces around him, is up and out. You need to communicate what your challenges are on the ground. And for us, it was simple. There wasn't enough soldiers. There weren't enough soldiers. So the ratio of security force personnel on the ground to the population was 6.8 security force personnel to 1,000. To conduct a counterinsurgency, you need 20 to 25 to 1,000 to be successful. It rose eventually to somewhere around 9 when we got an additional American battalion, but we could never get enough troops to hold the ground that we were clearing. And General Habibi and I talked about several skirmishes that we were in order to make that happen. So what I'm saying is the messages were clear, and I passed on every occasion I had to whoever would listen. 1, bring more Afghan soldiers down from the north. 2, double the size of the police Tashkil, which is their establishment. And 3, build a bloody ring road around Kandahar City so we're not pissing off half the population every time we drive through with an armored convoy. And I'll stop there. We can talk later about how successful I was in making those things happen, and maybe a couple of more anecdotes that are at the, shall we say, tactical level, but I'm sure you're going to get your fill from this lot. Thank you.
What's it like being, a bit isolated? You have your sergeant major, but you are the officer on your camp with your subordinates, platoon commanders, managing that battle space. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Okay, thanks, Austin. And it's such a pleasure to be here, first of all. And I just want to say, in the last couple of years, I haven't done a lot of speaking engagements. And were it not for the people who are here on this panel and the person who is organizing it today, I probably would be hunkered down in my basement still. So I really want to thank you for that, and happy to be here with everybody. So I'm going to talk about the impact of the dispersed fight through a story. Okay? So put your helmet on. So we were in patrol base Berwingar, and there was one day where there was we went out. I was out with one of our platoons, and on the way there we encountered an IED, and then as we moved further forward we encountered another IED, and then we started taking contact from the front. And so we were effectively, our mobility was limited. And just at that moment, an Apache came overhead and joined our net. And this wasn't something that we had done a lot in training. I mean, we had the opportunity to work with aircraft, but it wasn't something I didn't have at my disposal, the resources of an Apache that frequently. And so I asked the Apache to suppress the target, and I'll never forget the call sign came back on. It was long knife 1-1, 300, this is long knife 1-1, recommend a Hellfire. And I looked at the target. We were in the middle of a grape field, and it was a grape putt, and we had all sorts of space, and I thought, that's a good recommendation. And so I, looked at my map once, twice, 3 times to make sure I had the grids right, and I authorized that Hellfire to be released. The Hellfire came down on that gray putt, bang! The cheers from the troops, like it was an amazing moment. I will never forget how I felt in that moment. Everybody was thrilled that we had used the resources that were at our disposal. And so we made our way back to the camp. I was feeling like I had the best day of my life. And then I get on the net, 3-9er, this is 0, 9er needs to speak with you. And for those of you who served in Afghanistan, you know that there are weapons release restrictions. And so for me, it was easy because I was company commander. Direct fire was mine, and indirect fire was the boss's. So it was clear, except Hellfires were included as a battle group commander release weapon. And I hadn't paid attention to that because it had always been, I had always thought of the Hellfire as an indirect weapon system. So, my boss is in Kandahar, and I'm in PBSG, and he thinks I did it with full knowledge of the regulations. And he thinks he's got a company commander who's like going rogue. Right? Which is funny now. but in that moment, sickening, because I thought, all right, this could be the end. And it's almost impossible for me to convey to him that it was an earnest mistake because we were geographically separated. And while I learned a lot of lessons during the tactical fight about the amazing power of the joint resources and how using those resources can enable morale and help you win the fight, I learned also that when you break trust, it takes a heck of a long time to earn that trust back. And in a dispersed environment, it's even more challenging. And we got through it, we made it to the other side, but it was one of the most significant lessons that I learned during my tour. Both a good day and a bad day. I'll stop there.
From a soldier point of view, with the multiple tours, how do you guys approach that experience, and what was your Afghan experience like, and having come back a little bit early, being injured?
Well, first, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm actually honored to be in such great company, but I'm also humbled that I was asked to participate, because many times I always think, I always say that NCOs must be involved in the planning. I always say where an NCO is not involved, that's the first mistake of an officer. But then after I sit back and reflect, I always say when it comes to engaging like these, I always think that we don't have much to add, and then I was actually corrected and say that we do have a lot to add because of our different experience and shared experience. But first I'll say to you is about that question is that what I found in my 3 tours to Afghanistan that our soldiers are very resilient. And what I found about Canadian soldiers is that they will complain about everything. And one thing I'll say, when the soldiers stop complaining, is that you start worrying. Because that means they have no longer care about what's going on. So when they complain, that's a good thing. But they're resilient. And what I also found is that our troops love a mission. What I noticed is that when our troops, my first tour to Afghanistan, when I came back, the young privates and corporals wanted to go again. They wanted purpose. And I think when you're, especially in the infantry, and I can talk about the infantry, that's what I know, is that we like purpose and we like a mission. And that's what they're focused on. And in that mission, in doing the business, they will also build those bond of friendship that we've heard talked about from our veterans of World War II, that they build while in combat. And that's what I've seen with our troops. And we've always said that the troops are there for the long marathon, but the officers come for the sprint. And also in that, I noticed as well, troops are adaptive. They will adapt to the situation because we quickly adapt to a new company commander. We quickly adapt to a new platoon commander. I remember when we were doing a workout training for 110, when I showed up at one RCR actually, for my platoon, I was a young warrant officer, and I had a platoon of 63 brand new privates. Because at the time we didn't have enough NCOs to make the 3rd platoon. When we finally did, but then I was going through my 1st platoon commander, who was a SIGS officer, who decided he wanted to do the infantry thing. And I got tasked to go into another tour earlier while doing the workup training. And while gone, because we had so many officers in the battalion, we got an opportunity to work with a different officer who became a platoon commander, and the troops adapted very well. As well, we integrated 12 reservists in our platoon at the time and took 5 overseas. So again, it just shows that our troops are adaptive and they can adapt their leadership style with the officers because they have the mission to focus on. That's what it's really about. Thank you.
Controlling spirit, notwithstanding that, why are we here and what are we doing against the end state? So it's so dense and that's what I'm like.
Yeah, I think one of the toughest things you have to do as a formation commander is break the news to the Canadian public. And I didn't lose them, we lost 25 killed in action when I was the task force commander, and 103 wounded physically, and I have no idea how many were wounded psychologically. So it's difficult to stand up in front of the media and announce the death of a Canadian soldier to the Canadian public at large. But I think it's best if I just tell one single story. It's the death of John Snyder, who Todd probably remembers very well. John Snyder was a captain in the PPCLI. He was an omelet commander, and he was out on a patrol with a platoon from 2 PPCLI in the Zard-Panjwai district. And he slipped, on a night patrol, he slipped and fell into a kariz. And a kariz is an Afghan well, and he drowned in the desert. Imagine trying to explain that to the Canadian public. It's not easy, but it's a message that falls on the commander's shoulders. And while I think it's great that Austin and Eleanor got together 5 times over the course of their tour, when you're the boss, there is nobody else to consult with. You are on your own except for your sergeant major, and he will provide moral support as we know they do. And I had Chris White, who was another excellent PPCLI NCO. So what do you do when that happens? How do you get that platoon that had been on that patrol back on the horse? I was at Massengar when this happened, and the platoon returned to Patrol Base Wilson. So you can go look at the map afterwards, but anybody who's an Afghan vet will know exactly what I'm talking about. The next morning I went over and I spoke to the senior NCOs, the 3 section commanders and the platoon commander, and got them back on the horse, because it's important they understood it wasn't their fault. Because that's the first thing that happens, is people will blame it on themselves. So how do you approach a devastated group of young soldiers? It's simple. You just tell them, tell me what happened, and it all comes out. Let them tell the story and just listen. And so, that technique has worked for me on several occasions. I got some funnier stories than that one about people telling me what happened. Maybe too much, but I'll leave it there.
So I'm going to tell a story about Anthony and his platoon. So Anthony was a warrant officer for 7 Platoon on my tour. And 7 Platoon had a really tough beginning of the tour. I mean, it was from the moment we arrived, they were detached, they took some casualties, they came back, but 7 Platoon's morale was, I think, the highest in the company. I mean, it was really great. And that was due in very large part to Anthony and his leadership and the relationship that he had with the soldiers of the platoon. And we had a number of incidents in front of our patrol base, and there had been a fight a couple of days earlier, and I'll never ever forget this, but we were going to go back into that area, into Sketcha, and Anthony and his platoon commander were taking their platoon out to do it, and we were also sending a platoon to the south. And Anthony came to me and said, I really think we need to take the ambulance to where we're going. And I said, nope, the ambulance is staying in the center because we have a platoon to the south and we have a platoon to the north, and so I'm going to keep it in the center. And we almost never argued. Because most of the time I took his advice. But in this instance, I did not take his advice, and his platoon got hit hard, and he got hit with an RPG in his shoulder, and he was a Pri 1 casualty, and it took us 45 minutes to get him out. And I will never forget how I felt and how I knew he would feel and how I knew the platoon would feel. And I didn't get to talk to Anthony again until we got back. And the platoon, who had already been through a lot and was rooted in 306 soldiers who had had the experience of Medusa and then lost their platoon warrant, were devastated. And it took a long time to remotivate. And they were a great group of soldiers, and we had a great replacement 2IC come in, and a great platoon commander, and they rallied, but it was tough. And I think about, we were talking about this before the panel, but moments. And we all, anyone who's engaged in conflict in any way, there are moments, and everybody is living a chapter in that moment that will come back to them in different ways. And so the question was, how do you deal with these kinds of incidents? And I really think now I'd love to turn it over to Anthony and talk about what happened either on that day or on the other side of that day.
Well, it's funny, and I'm glad you were transparent to say that we didn't agree. And typically, it's as a platoon warrant officer, my commanding partner is the platoon commander, so really do I interact with the company commander as a platoon warrant. That's a sergeant major's job. But I just demonstrated kind of leadership at the time, Major Taylor was, and she asked opinion and advice, right? So, but we went out, and when we got back out there, as soon as we dismounted, I realized I was missing a person. And I looked around and I said, oh, where's the interpreter? And the doc says, how do you do that so quick? I said, well, everyone carries a rifle, the interpreter doesn't. So I know who's missing. And I turned to my corporal that he was in charge of the interpreter in the headquarters vehicle and said, hey, where's the interpreter? And he felt so bad because we had taken a little pause before we got on the patrol, and it was early afternoon. So they're getting hydrated, eating freeze and stuff, mount up. He totally forgot the interpreter. And I just, in an aggressive warrant officer, I said, we'll talk about it later. Let's go. And that's what we did. Well, we never talked about it later. And that soldier wore that burden until I got back to Canada, and I was able to tell him that it was okay. My point is that soldiers take things sometimes personally because they believe in what they do, right? So he took it personally, and my wife told me before I got home, said, hey, if someone keeps calling from the overseas number that you typically call me on, and they just sit there and they don't say anything. I said, really? And I said, oh, I know that. And she goes, well, how do you know? You're in Germany. They're in Afghanistan. I said, oh, I know that. Because I knew my troops. And I didn't tell her who it was. And I got home and I was recovering, and that same thing happened to me. And I just said, and I call his name now, God rest his soul. I said, Corporal Lee, it's okay. Because he carried out for the entire rest of the tour that he had let the platoon down because he forgot the interpreter. But what I told him was, the interpreter that day was not required. Because we came into contact, and when we were talking, we were shooting, killing, and trying to survive. Right? And soldiers focus on those things. What I can say, though, talking to the platoon afterwards, when they got their new warrant, I was told that they got together, the company commander, company sergeant to talk to them, they were good to go, and they rebuilt. But how do you deal with loss? You accept it, and I got injured that day, but what I realized when I was lying there, and I didn't know what happened, and I'll tell you about a good Canadian named Corporal Eric Binet, who was a reservist at that time on the tour. One of the guys I didn't want to take on the tour, but I had sent him on a TCCC, which is Tactical Combat Casualty Care Course, and he did very well. So I said, you will go on the tour then, and you will be in the Charlie boat as our backup medic, but you also help the C9 because he was a very good soldier in that regard. When we did that operation, I knew where the vehicles were. He was in the vehicle, rear security, and when I got hit and I was on the ground and I realized that I was injured, I was trying to find where my weapon was. I picked it up with my left hand. I was yelling, my arm, because I thought he was gone. I couldn't see it. It was blown behind me. I felt the gushing. I saw blood. I couldn't, because I was on the ground. I couldn't get up. And I just keep hearing this voice, your arm is behind you. And I'm like, behind me? And I'm like, oh, I didn't lose my arm. Because my thought was, if I go, my only prayer was, when I come back from Afghanistan, I can be okay with a mental injury. I can be okay with a wound, but I do not want to have a missing limb. So as I was lying there, and he keeps saying, your arm is behind you, I thought it was gone. And I closed my eyes and I said these words, and I still remember them. God, all I want to do is walk off the plane and hug my wife with my own two hands. That's all I said. Open my eyes, find the weapon, realize we're under contact, and You know, we train for these things, and when you realize that you're in it, you know, I never been on a two-way range. All of a sudden, I'm like, oh, where are all these bees from? I'm like, that's not bees. That's rounds going by your head and dirt flying. You're under contact. I'm like, contact. And everyone said, yes, we see it. I hear this guy, your arm is behind you. I'm like, that's called Monet. He's in the lab vehicle. That young Canadian left the comfort of an armored vehicle in the Leaguer because he saw what happened. And he said, I got to go to the warrant and to the medic, because the medic tribe was me, to make sure they were good, because I don't think they survived that blast. Until the second RPG came over the vehicle, as I was told the story, when he was dismounted, that's when they realized it was an RPG attack and not an IED strike. And that young K ran 250 meters to my aid, administered first aid, dragged me to the CCP, which was already designated as we were moving cross country, because they manned the radio, and gave me first aid. The doc was down as well, because the doc was also injured. And we recovered from that moment until the QRF came. And what I want to tell you is that, you know, mentally, when I was sitting there thinking, you know, it goes through your mind now, but as I reflect, my thought was, if I didn't pick up my C8 and try to fire back and still be the platoon 2IC, then all the things I've said to them as an example would have been for naught. Because that kept them in the fight, because the warrant didn't stop doing what the warrant's supposed to do. You had to physically detach my radio from me to stop talking so I could stop bleeding. The sergeant took over the platoon, I got medevaced, and I was told later on how long the firefight was. But this is my little, I call it my new lease, I call my little buddy. I keep him on my desk. It's a story. This is the shrapnel for my right shoulder that struck me on that day. What I tell people all the time is that our kit works. And I'll tell you why our kit works. I tell troops all the time, our training works, because when I got hit, I found that I was in a dark place, I was injured, but I had to stay in the fight. So I found my seat and I have two arms, right doesn't work, use the left. Corporal Monet, when he was firing the C9, he said, hey Warren, I'm about to run out. If I have to reload, can you cover me? I said, yep. That good Canadian knocked me over when he was about to finish, because we're still under contact. He couldn't get me out yet, because the doc was also yelling for help, and he just kept firing to keep getting his head down. And this came out on my shoulder, right? So we're resilient, we revert to our training. That's what I'll tell you. That man, what is what I call courage. But coming back from it, I had to know that I was hurt, I was down, but I wanted to come back stronger than I was and be example to others. So recovery is possible. And when I always say to the troops, well, when you're hurting, know where to go and don't be afraid to ask for the help. And have I been to that place? Yes. But I can say that, you know, to the question, it's hard to recover from loss, but I think it's where your mindset is. But the troops are focused, and they will always stay in the fight once they're getting the example.
I'm not really sure where to go to next. Yeah, and I know that story, and you sort of live it on the radio when you're there, trying to get as many folks from Bravo Company to support, or whether it was a Chinook that was shot down. Like you once the net goes with, you know, contact weighed out and then the casualty, it gets pretty quiet. I'll do a bit of a pivot, kind of what you've talked about with soldiers and resiliency, and you know where we are now in the world. Dennis's quick bio, you know, spent some time in the Middle East, and clear on focusing on not POTUS, which is a mission in Israel, but the Sinai, and with the world as it is today, with the conflict that's taking place in the Middle East and in Europe. And it's going to be a three-part question on where economies and sort of all approach it. You know, are there lessons learned from Afghanistan that we need to be paying attention to? Potentially at the formation level and how we show up. We have troops in Riga, and I talked about I was recently there about 2 weeks ago, and all the troops that are doing it, when you go see them as a person, as a soldier, are doing the business, you know. So, and as I go through the thread, and you talk about soldiers' resiliencies, and being at the infantry school now and training young soldiers and officers to prepare for the next conflict, considerations, lessons learned from Afghanistan. Are we doing the right things with respect to prepare our young officers and soldiers? And I want to look for you to comment as that as well, as you sort of recently left that community but are contributing with respect to not-for-profit organizations like True Patriot Love and sort of monitoring young soldiers that are in and sort of currently getting out and need the support after a time of retirement. Let me start with you, Dennis.
Well, I don't think I'm going to speak about the Middle East because it's probably not the most appropriate case, but I thought what I would say is, as a formation commander, when you're committing soldiers to an operation, you have to make sure they are set for success. In other words, they have all the resources they need. And oftentimes, one of the resources that you don't control is time. And you're forced to put people into a battle when they're not perhaps entirely ready. And so the example I have involves my dear friend Major General Habibi and the Arghandab district, which we lost in the spring of 2008 to the Taliban and had to take it back. And so it went all the way up to Bismillah Khan, who was the Chief of Defense Staff. I mean, he came down to the Arghandab district to supervise Thompson in his efforts to synchronize this whole thing with General Habibi, with the local NDS guy, with the provincial chief of police, etc. And they also brought a 1,000-man battalion from Kabul without their mentors. Their mentors were from France, and they weren't allowed to come down. So you've got 1,000 Afghan soldiers that are going to be committed to a battalion, to a battle, without their mentors, and therefore without the connectivity to all the enablers that are out there. So we cobbled together an omelet, and we stuck them in with these new guys from Kabul. Meanwhile, General Habibi and his Kandak were attached to a company from 2PPCLI. Again, Scott McGregor was the 2IC at the time, and he ended up being the OC. And they succeeded in taking back the southern part of the Arghandab district in that first day, which we watched from across the river off the roof of the Kandahar district. Then we launched this Kabul-based Kandak at them, and they failed miserably. How long had the Omeletiers, and it was Danny Drew, by the way, we all know and love. Danny Drew was heading the charge up, and frankly, they had spent 2 hours with their charges before they went in. 2 hours is not enough time to build up the confidence necessary to hook up your Omeletiers with the Afghan soldiers, when you consider that our guys, like our partners, we had been with for years. And they suffered 2 dead and 2 wounded, and it was a horrendous withdrawal, and we had to redo it to get a do-over the next day before we could take the objective back. So the lesson for me is, at the formation level, don't commit yourself despite the pressure, and there was a lot of pressure. And I'm sure General Habibi will tell you that when the Chief of Defense Staff comes down to supervise your operation, you can't make excuses. And as a result, we took casualties. Thankfully, they weren't that heavy, and thankfully, from my perspective anyway, I didn't lose any Canadian soldiers, although they were committed. And even better, it proved to me that these guys, the guys that we were partnered with, they knew their business. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Quick edit. I'll jump to you to talk about the infantry school, and then I will pop up because just we talked some time, see if there's any questions from the crowd, and I'll make my way around and sort of give you the opportunity to ask questions to the panel. But soldiers today, preparing them the right way for what's in front of us?
To be honest, I say yes. At the infantry school, one of the things I say when the young officers for the Army show up, I say, you know what, you're the one that's here standing in front of me because you volunteered to join our team, serve our country, and we give you the best training that we have available. And then those who are serious about it, great about it, make it to the other side. We do have challenges, and one of the challenges I'll say, like we did in Afghanistan, is kit. When I said earlier before, the kit is good, and when we get it, it does work. If it wasn't for the new brassard we had in theater, that metal I showed you would have just ripped my shoulder off. That's what I was told by the doctor and all the researchers. And that is why it's in the shape it is, because it changed direction based on the brassard. That was Kevlar. Resiliency, we have a new program that comes to resiliency, and we teach that at the school as well. So we do have the right, I'll go back, sometimes we don't get the right people in the organization, and I think that's a recruiting challenge, which someone has to work on, not my issue at the infantry school. So whoever we get, we train, and they are resilient. And if you go back at any time, and I think John Thompson alluded to earlier, years ago when I joined the 80s, people would say we were, our section would say, you were worse than what I came through, but we all say that, but it's just the way it is. And we train them, we're hard on them, and we get the best product at the end.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sirs, ma'am, CWO, for sharing your experiences. It's tremendous to hear and it's incredibly valuable. My question would be, as we transition more and more to a peacetime army with very different operation tempo, what can we do to make sure that these incredibly valuable lessons and stories that you're all sharing today can be instilled in not just our new soldiers, but across the forces in general, just to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next, because there's just so much value in what we're hearing today.
So good question. So quickly I'll give it's about Army Soul story. When I was going to Afghanistan the second time, my mom, who actually and I grew up in a Christian home, so I have a lot of faith, said to me, son, why are you going to Afghanistan? There's a war going on there. Isn't the Canadian Armed Forces peacekeepers? And I said, Mom, we don't have a cat, but if you have a cat and it's up in a tree and you call 911 to get the cat down, who comes? The fire department. Is that firefighter a cat rescuer or a firefighter? We're not peacekeepers, and people say that, and that's what I always tell them. We train to do the business, and I'm an infant here, so I talk like an infant here. We train, so when people come to my school, I tell them, we train for your worst day. And what I can let the camera is that we're very adaptive. And I'll tell you, my first tour to Afghanistan to my third tour to Afghanistan was very different. My first tour was in Kabul, and that demonstrated to me that we can pivot on a dime. But what I'll say though, and this is a caution I tell it all the time to my staff, let's be careful though that we're not digressing the training. Because we're in a new society and new political arena where some folks in there, it's let's be at home more and less away doing the training. But the training we provide to our soldiers and officers, in my opinion, is world class, and I live by that because I'm a product of that, and I can demonstrate we can pivot it down. I went to Kosovo, my first tour, as a peacekeeper, but in no time we transitioned easily. So that's what I say with the CAF, we're adaptive, and we can pivot when the time comes. And the last thing is, we just need that support to have the right equipment at the right time to conduct the business when it's required to do so. Hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
I wonder, Dennis, want to add to that?
Well, 2 seconds, right? So I was a platoon commander in Germany. That's how old I am. So I went to Latvia last fall or last summer in my capacity as a colonel of the regiment, which is why I can tell you, hand on heart, that our soldiers are no different today than they were back when I was a platoon commander in the 80s. And they're learning that it's not Afghanistan anymore. There's lots of valuable stuff that comes out of Afghanistan, but we had air supremacy, not air superiority, air supremacy. We didn't give a tinker's damn about our air cover. We didn't have to. They certainly do now. And there's a whole host of other things that they need to concern themselves with that we learned back in those Germany days that they're learning now, and they are embracing it with enthusiasm. So I've got complete confidence, as Anthony does, and as Elmer does, in the quality of the soldiers that we have today. Give them the tools and they'll get the job done.
Great job, guys. This is incredible. I'm really enjoying hearing your stories. It's a great testament to our country's stature. What can you tell us about the character of the Afghanistan people? And what similarities you saw with that character and how it meshed with that character?
All right, so I'm going to stand behind General Habibi when I say this. And I'm just very short. Courageous to the point of being foolhardy. That's it.
I have to agree. We were partnered with a company and we did everything together, extraordinarily courageous and extraordinarily professional. And another thing that we've all learned having deployed to different places, so in my case it was Kosovo, Bosnia, and Afghanistan, is that fundamentally people are people at their core. They want the same things. They want security for their families. They want to be able to enjoy their lives, marry their children, have their babies, and they're looking to set the conditions for that to happen. And that, that was indeed true in Afghanistan. And sometimes people looked at me as a woman company commander and asked, was it difficult to interact with the men who were deployed with you, or the men, the Afghan men? And in my case, no, not at all. I had no difficulty interacting with those folks who were interested in fighting with us, because the primacy was the fight. and nothing else. So, anybody else?
Just quickly, on my second tour, I worked with the police on the Palmet team. What I noticed from them is that they're strong, they're resilient, like we are, because they got a purpose. And that was what I observed at the time, at that day, at that moment. And what I've always been amazed about, they're talented people. When I was there on my first tour, because we had a little bit of time for luxury, I found the best tailor in Afghanistan. And I came back with 13 suits that were handmade. So they're very talented, but I enjoyed it. They're great people.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now and thank you for joining us.